In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was in desperate need of a new, modern airliner. But rather than just catching up to the West, they were about to make a massive gamble on a new technology. The world was shocked when the British unveiled the first aircraft propelled by jet engines in 1952. The de Havilland Comet flew 15,000 feet higher and nearly twice as fast as any aircraft before it. Its creation had involved a significant amount of work and years of study and development. And although through jet engines were still quite new and unproven, many could see that they were the next step in the development of aviation, including famous Soviet-era aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev, who regarded them as a means of advancing Soviet air travel. Air travel on a large scale would be made possible by a jet aircraft like the Comet, which would reduce the flight duration by a third. The issue was that the Soviet leadership considered jets to be unstable, expensive, and fuel thirsty. Additionally, it had taken the Comet more than 10 years and millions of dollars to develop. Soviet authorities did not want to commit the necessary time or resources. But Tupolev had a strategy. He assured the top Soviet officials that he could have a jet ready in just 3 years, an affordable, dependable jet airliner that can carry even more passengers than the Comet. Additionally, a jet airliner that Soviet design would demonstrate to the world that the Soviet Union was just as advanced as the West. They had no choice but to accept the offer. But how do you build a state-of-art jetliner like the Comet in just 3 years? You do, however, begin with a significant shortcut. This is the Tu-16 bomber that Tupolev used as the foundation of his new airliner and was constructed to rain bombs over Europe. Tupolev believed he was almost halfway there and only needed to widen the fuselage because he had just finished designing it for the Soviet Air Force. However, he could maintain the engine despite the fact that they weren't the most efficient and were a little noisy. He could also reuse the wings, even though they were better suited for the high-speed bombing mission, which would cut down on engineering work. The pilot might only need to land a little bit quicker. The tail and the vertical stabilizer might both be employed again using the same principle. Additionally, parts for the bomber's landing gear, avionics and other systems could be taken straight off the assembly line. The heavy-duty military components would add up to nearly 100,000 pounds, making for a one-story airliner, designed in record time and built at a fraction of cost. Tupolev would name the new airliner as the Tu-104. While Tupolev was putting the finishing touch on his plane, it would become apparent that the transition to the jet travel wouldn't be so straightforward. By 1954, the Comet had been grounded due to the design problems that had led to a string of fatal accidents. While the matter was being investigated, the Comet was prohibited for commercial flight for the next 4 years. By the time the new jet airliner developed by the Soviet Union made its first test flight in June 1955, the Soviet had unexpectedly came into the possession of the sole operational jet airliner in the entire world. But instead of seeing it as a warning, they seized the chance for propaganda. A group of Soviet leaders traveled to Britain in 1956 on the 104 while it was still undergoing flight testing. Many were taken aback by the aircraft that resembled. The Soviets were believed by the press to have advanced the West by years with a larger and more advanced design. It was a victory for the Soviets. Additionally, it wouldn't be the final time they flaunt their new aircraft. Over the coming months, 104s visited cities across Europe. Each time crowd greeted the aircraft and dignitaries were given an opportunity to marvel at the Soviet technology. In 1957, a 104 even showed up to the Paris Air Show, making first ever appearance by a non-Western built aircraft. A few months later, the new airliner flew all the way to the United States for another state visit, making the first ever transatlantic crossing by a jet airliner. For Soviet, the 104 was a huge hit, and quickly developing it out of a bomber seemed like a masterstroke. However, there were already some warning signals of disaster. The Tu-104 was difficult to operate in comparison to other commercial aircraft. Pilots complained about the heavy, unresponsive controls. The aircraft's heavy weight and highly swept wing made flying at low speed extremely difficult. Landing at crowded commercial airports proved difficult. Because of their extreme fear of stalling, pilots frequently made faster than intended landings. Another problem with stopping was that the airliner lacked an airbag, no thrust reversal, and weak wheel brakes. The only thing that frequently prevented an aircraft from flying past the runway was a deployed parachute. However, the complaints went unheard. That is until 1958, when the airliner began showing behaviors that were impossible to ignore. The first sign of trouble came in February when a 104 flew into the turbulence, which caused both the engines to flame out without power. The aircraft fell 20,000 feet before the pilots managed to relight the engines. A month later, another aircraft caught in turbulent weather, but this time the aircraft was hurled up into the sky and pilots couldn't stop it from climbing all the way to 44,000 feet higher than the plane should ever fly. Eventually, the plane stalled and began tumbling back to the earth before the pilots managed to regain control. Despite the near disaster, Soviet authority blamed the pilots. But the incident continued. In August, another 104 was mysteriously hurled up into the sky. Again, the aircraft stalled, but this time pilots couldn't recover and there was no survivors. Just 2 months later, a 104 flying between Beijing and Moscow was once again hurled into the sky. This time, the pilot radioed back details as they were happening. While he couldn't save the aircraft, the information radioed back would prove vital. Authorities could no longer ignore the bizarre series of accidents. There was clearly something wrong in the aircraft. However, they refused to ground the plane, instead allowed it to keep transporting people as they continued to investigate the problem. Investigators would eventually come to the conclusion that the cause was strong updraft that the pilots were unable to withstand. And the reason was the plane had bomber roots. Depending on how the aircraft was loaded, the bigger pressurized cabin of the 104 was shown to have its center of gravity pushed rearwards. As a result, the 104 was powerless to resist the force that would naturally cause it to tip upwards in an updraft, leaving the pilot defenseless. A number of emergency modifications were made and the aircraft was restricted for flying above a certain altitude. But not before another incident in 1959, when another 104 hit an updraft before the pilots managed to recover. A critical design flaw had cost 144 lives. Despite improvement, the aircraft would continue building up a long list of other incidents. Overshoots on the runway were the most frequent. Almost one in every 5 TU-104 manufactured would be accidentally destroyed. Nevertheless, the aircraft earned an infamous reputation among travelers, even taking one of the form of a folk song in 1960s. Tu-104 самый лучший самолет. За 5 минут вас в могилу довезет. The Soviets invested substantially in developing the first jet aircraft, just like the British did. But by 1958, the Comet had undergone an extensive redesign and was once again in use, as well as the Americans had introduced their own jet airliner. Any previous propaganda value the 104 may have had was lost. But the Soviet Union first jetliner played a vital role in modernizing the air travel inside the country. To accommodate the jet, air traffic control systems were modified, new terminals were built, and the runway was lengthened. And the operational lesson learned from the 104 would help pave the way for future Soviet airliners, earning the 104 a spot amongst the world's pioneering aircraft. The next video is going to be on one of my favorite aircraft, the Concorde, the R&D and all we need to know about the Concorde, how it began to fly and how it came to an end. I hope you like this video. Please like, share and subscribe to our channel to know more about aviation. Thank you. Bye till next time.